Many games create unforgettable characters which truly shine because of the text that brings their emotions to life. I have amazing news because we can actually do the same thing through BBCode. With BBCode we can format text, add images to it, add pulses, shakes, fades, waves, rainbows, combine all of those and even create our custom effects. But I'm getting a bit too excited, so let us start with the basics. BBCode uses tags and basically all you have to do is to simply add your text, put a BBCode tag surrounded by brackets at the beginning and put a BBCode tag surrounded by brackets with a slash at the end. And just like that, you got your tag effect. On top of that, you can make your tags behave differently by adding options to them or by giving them different values. Now, first of all, what I need in order to even use BBCode is to have a rich text label which has BBCode enabled. You'll see that after I click this, all my code is going to get formatted with the effects of these tags. Now, let us actually see what these tags do. So, for example, if I zoom this in, you'll see that I have the classic bold, italic, strike through and underline tags, but I also have here a tag to which I can actually set a value. So here this tag is called color and yeah, again, as you'd expect, it sets the color of my text and I can set it to red, to blue or to whatever color I know, or maybe I could set it to a hexadecimal value. So I could write something like 1, 2, 1, 5 and 5, 4 and you'll see that I get this darker blue. Okay, now similarly what I can do is to also change the background color of the text to be yellow in this example, and as you can see I can also combine tags, so I can have multiple tags defined at once and have both the effects applied. So as you can see this text is not only with a yellow background but it also has a black color. Now, one thing we should be aware of in this case is that we could interlock our tags and that would cause problems. So whenever we write these tags, we always have to close them in reverse order. So for example, if I were to take this slash color and put it at the end, you see that nothing quite works well anymore. Okay, now the next thing that I can do is to define a URL. And if I want, for example, I don't know, maybe to take players to my Discord server or to my community forum or something else, I could add a URL just like this with the URL tag. Now, maybe you don't fancy how this URL looks like, and I think that would be perfectly reasonable. And in that case, you could just set the URL to have the value of the actual URL, and inside the tag, you could set the text. So you could say here, click me, and as you can see, it creates an underlined URL. Now, as I said before, not only can we simply format text, we can also add images to it. So for example, here I have text, and in between I have an image tag to which I only had to specify the path of the image in my resources. So for example, icon.svg is the actual image, and yeah, you can see it here. However, what's very nice is that we can configure the position of this image, and in order to do that I just have to specify where my image should be relative to the text. So for example, I could say, hey, I want to have the top of my image to be at the bottom of the text. So to do that I would just write top, comma, bottom, and you see that the top of my image is at the bottom of the text. And I could do any kind of combination of this. I could want the top of my image to be at the center of the text. So just write center. And you see that now it's slightly higher. Okay, one other interesting thing is that I can set the image to be at the text baseline, which is basically just the bottom part of the letters. So I would just write here baseline, and you can see that the top is here. And of course, maybe if you don't like the top, maybe you want to align it to the bottom, we could write here bottom, or we could even write only bottom, and this basically means that the bottom of the image is at the bottom of the text. But let's set it back to bottom baseline because I also want to show you how we can change the size of the image. All we have to do is just to say how many pixels this image should have. So if I write, for example, 30, you'll see that this image has the same size as all these other ones. Now, here are just some possible configurations for however you would want your image to be, and These configurations can be also applied to tables. Okay, but what are tables? Well, tables are just ways of configuring the layout of our content. So for example, I could say that I want my content inside the table tag to be put into rows of 2 elements. So I just have to write table equals 2. However, if I wanted to have 4 elements on a row, I would just write table equals 4, and as you can see, I have 4 elements. But let's move back to table equals 2 because I also want to show you how I can align this table. Now, just as before, just as with the images, what I could do would be to say, hey, I want the top of my table to be at the bottom of my text. So I could write top and bottom, and as you can see, it laid out perfectly. Now, there is one special case with tables. We could say that I want the baseline of my table to be at the baseline of the text, and now I could specify which row of the table should be at the baseline of the text. So I could write, for example, 0, so now the first row is at the baseline of the text. I could write 1, and you see that now is the second row. I could write 2, and so on, to put the text at whatever row I want. Oh, and by the way, all elements inside the table should be cells, or otherwise the table is simply not going to do anything with whatever content I have in here. Okay, now finally, some other useful tags would be center, left, and right, which, yeah, as you'd expect, they center, left align, and right align the text. Now, while the formatting options are obviously very important, I bet you're probably here because you want to see the amazing effects you can do with Godot. So, Godot actually has a few built-in effects, which are pulse, wave, tornado, shake, fade, and rainbow, and all these effects can be configured through options. So, for example, this rainbow can have a different frequency. I can make this rainbow be slower, I could make it 0.2, and you see now an obvious difference. Also, I could change the saturation to be 0.2, and again, it's a different rainbow, the value, the speed, and so on. And also, just as before, what I can do is to combine these effects. So maybe I could use this classic wave rainbow effect, and as you can see, I pretty much just have a rainbow that's wavy. Sometimes it might happen that your text will get out of the rich text label, and in those cases you just have to go to layout and uncheck clip contents and you will just see your elements. Yeah, but while these effects are amazing in and of themselves, what's most exciting is the fact that we can build our own effects. And we can actually do that pretty easily, and I'm going to show you how. First of all, what I have to do is to add a new script. So I'm just going to create a new script. Let's call it my script. And in this script, what I need is to make it first a tool so that it's going to be visible in the editor. So I'm just going to write add tool. Now I also have to extend the rich text effect because this is the class that our rich text label is going to use for all the effects. Now, after I give it also a class name, so let's just say class name, I don't know, my effect, I will be able to use it. And if I go to my rich text label, I should be able to see under markup an array which currently has 0 elements, but if I click on it, I can add a new element and I can select my effect from here. Okay, but I selected my effect. How do I refer it through a BBCode tag? Well, currently I can't do that. Sorry for scrolling. Currently I can't do that because I haven't defined the name of my tag. And to define that name, all I have to do is to write var BBCode and set it equal to whatever the tag should be called. And as you might have noticed, I have this test tag here, so let's just call it test. And now if I save, you'll see that nothing happens. And of course, nothing happens because we haven't yet overwritten how these elements behave. To do that, we'll just have to override the process custom effects function. So what I have to do is to write func process custom effects of char effects and pass. And this char effects is actually of type char effects transform. And I'm writing this type because I want us to go into it and see what the properties of these are. With this small amount of properties, we are going to be able to do a lot of things. So for example, let's just take at the beginning the color and the relative index property. The color pretty much just changes the color of the current character, and the relative index tells me which is the index of the current character. So what I could do would be to go to my script, and in here I could, for example, say char fx.color.g, so the green channel of my color is equal to 0.0. If I now save, if I go to 2D, you'll see, first of all, that the test tag is not doing anything. Sometimes this happens, and all you have to do is to just reload the current project. And now that I reloaded, you'll see that the text is now magenta, because if I removed the green channel, the only channels that remain are blue and red, which combine to magenta. Okay, but let's make something a bit more interesting. For example, instead of using 0.0, let's make it 0.1 multiplied by char fx.relative index. Now, if I go back, you'll see that this makes a pretty good gradient. Now, let's try to make this even better. What I could do would be, for example, to change another channel. I could also change the blue channel, and instead of going from 0 to 1, what I could do would be to, for example, go from 1 to 0. So I just have to write 1 minus 0.1 or char fx relative index. If I now save, if I go to 2D, you'll see that now my gradient has two colors, magenta for red and blue, and yellow for green and red. Okay, but what if we wanted to make an effect that moves our text just like these ones? How could we do that? Well, to do that, we have to use another property of our char fx, which is the offset. The offset does pretty much what the name says, offsets the character from the original position to a new position. So what I could do would be to write char fx.offset.y equals to something. Now, if I want my character to bob up and down, I could write a sine function. So I could write sine of something. Now, what would that something be? If I write here a constant value, obviously it's just gonna return sine of that constant, which is a single point, so there's gonna be no movement. What I can return instead is the char fx elapsed time. So if I write char fx.elapsed time, well, again, it's pretty obvious, it's the time that passed since the char has been written. So if I save, if I go here, you'll see that something happened. I don't know if you noticed, but this text moved a little up and then down. Okay, but at this point we can make this even more interesting by adding the classic sine properties, the amplitude, the frequency, the offset, and let's, for example, add the frequency. If I multiply this by 30, for example, I could go to 2D, and now you see that this text definitely moves faster. I can also change the amplitude. I could say, for example, 20 multiplied by sine of this thing, and yeah, it moves up and down on larger distances. And I could also change the offset. Now, what would I want this offset to be? Well, let's change the offset depending on this relative index. So if I do this, look what happens. I pretty much created a worse wave effect. Okay, now obviously it wouldn't be nice to have to come to my script and then move back to 2D and come to my script and go back to 2D whenever I wanted to change these values. It would be nice if I could change these values directly in my tag. And I can actually do that because char fx has a property called env. With env, we are going to get the environment variables of our tag, which are basically all the options that we will provide here. Now, how do we use this? Well, first of all, let's just say that we want to get the frequency. So I'm just going to write var frequency equals to what? Well, it equals to char fx.env, and this is going to return a dictionary of all the options that have been added. It could also be an empty dictionary. So if we want to have default values for when there are no values, what I would have to do would be to write .get, and in here I could just write what do I want to get. Well, I want to get FREQ, and if I don't have the FREQ option defined, then I would probably just write 1 by default. Okay, now let's do the same thing for our amplitude and for our offset. So I'm just gonna copy this and say amp, let's just call it amp, and off, let's just call it off. Now, what I could do would be to use these instead of what I've been using before. So let's set the frequency here, let's set the amplitude here, and for the offset, maybe let's just multiply the relative index with this offset value. Okay, if I now go here, you'll see that nothing pretty much happens. Oh, no, don't do what you're doing. Output. Yeah. Okay. No, stop. Okay, now what did actually happen here? Well, whenever we write code for our effects, that code is going to be run for each character at each moment. And since we had a test tag already written, after we introduced an error, well, the code ran and printed all these errors to our console, and it could have led to our program crashing. So you just have to be careful maybe to not edit directly the code while the tag is already there, or to just really quickly remove the tag if there is such an error. So yeah, in my case, what I did was to actually get the character 1 instead of getting 1.0, which is a float. And now after I'll get 1.0, I think I can add the test tag again with some long text and /test. And if I save, I am no longer getting those errors. Now, if I go to 2D, some long text is slightly moving. Okay, and what I can do is to actually not even think about the script, is to just go here and say frequency, or actually it was FREQ equals to 5. And you see that this moves faster. I could set it to maybe 20, and this is even faster. Now the amplitude was amp, and this is equal to 2 or 3 or 4. As you can see, I can modify it very easily. Now, just for the sake of completeness, let's set the offset to, I don't know, be 0.1, sorry, 0.1, okay, or maybe 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. You see how it wiggles more whenever I increase this offset, so 0.9. It's a pretty interesting feature. Okay, but again, why stop here? I could add even more functionality. For example, I could copy this thing and change the x offset based on the cosine. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware of how sine and cosine work together, but generally changing the x offset with cosine and the y offset with sine is going to make a circle. And now, if we go back to 2D, you'll see that our text is making little circles. And of course, I could change the amplitude to 5 or 10 or whatever, and the offset to 0.1 maybe, and you see I got a really wonderful effect. Okay, from this point on we can just start playing. What would happen, for example, if I decided to use a sine instead of this cos? Well, if I went to 2D, you see that this looks like it's a flag waving in the wind, and all I had to do was pretty much change 3 characters. Okay, now I changed a bit the frequency, amplitude and offset of this and changed this to a caterpillar because I want my text to be a caterpillar. So how could I make it move like a caterpillar? To do that, all I would have to do would be to change the transform of each character. So what I would have to do would be to say charfx.transform equals to charfx.transform.translated, and in here I would just have to specify a vector 2. And I'm just gonna write vector 2, and because I want it to continuously move, I'm just gonna make it depend on the elapsed time. So I'm just gonna write charfx.elapsed time. And vertically, I don't want my caterpillar to start flying, so I'm just gonna save it like this. And yeah, I'm not sure if you can tell, but yeah, the caterpillar is slightly moving. Maybe I could make this a bit faster. Let's make it 10. And oh, I can't even see my caterpillar. Maybe let's write it again. Yeah, after I wrote it again, it resetted its position and now it started moving again. Let's make it very fast. I'm gonna save it at 100 and let's reset the position. It's going fast. Now, obviously, this is not the only transform we can change. For example, we could say, hey, this should be chareffects.transform.rotated. So I could rotate this and rotate it by some value. Let's rotate it by 1 radian. And as you can see, if I go here, oh, my caterpillar has rotated. It's so easy to lose you, buddy. Where are you? Okay, and one important thing is that rotated is going to always be around this anchor point. So let's, for example, rotate around each character. What I could do would be to write rotated local, and if I go now again to D, now my caterpillar is always rotated by 1. Well, what if I wanted to rotate continuously? Well, let's just rotate by the elapsed time. If I do that, well, my letters start rotating. Okay, now as much as I'd like playing with this forever, I still have to move on with the video because I still have to show you one more thing. I think it would be very useful to be able to have a finite time to execute our animation. And we can do that pretty easily with this code that I added here. Basically, what we can do is to set a duration in the parameters. So here as an option, I could set duration equals to, I don't know, maybe 3. And with this duration set, I could simply divide the elapsed time by this duration and clamp it between 0 and 1. So basically at the beginning, this value of A is going to be of value 0. And at the end of this time that I've given here, so for example 3, this A is going to be 1. So in my case, I use this A because I wanted to change the alpha of my caterpillar. So let's make a magical caterpillar that appears randomly. So if I now press R, you see that slowly my caterpillar fades into existence. And if I make the duration maybe 1, you see that it comes into existence much faster. And if I set it to 10, it takes its time to come into existence. Now, of course, again, just as before, we could make this even more interesting by maybe making characters to the left appear sooner than characters to the right. So I could just subtract from this elapsed time the relative index of my character. So I could just write this minus chareffects dot relative index. And of course, if I close the bracket, if I look here and respawn my caterpillar, you see that the C comes here, then the A, then the T, then the E, the R, and so on. So yeah, I really love this because such small changes provide such big results. Now, I'm gonna show you one last example, and I swear this is the last one. If, for example, I didn't want to fade in the characters, if I wanted them to appear one by one, instead of just applying this alpha to my color A, what I could do is to apply either 0 or 1 depending on this quote-unquote animation being finished. So what I could do would be to set it to 0.0 if A is smaller or smaller than 1.0, or otherwise to set it to 1.0. And if I now go to 2D and if I respawn my caterpillar, you will see that I see a C, an A, T, E, and so on. Okay, now I'm not sure if you could tell, but I really enjoyed making this video. So thanks a lot for watching, thanks to my coffee supporters, and see you in the next one. Bye!